Hey everybody, welcome back. Thanks for taking the time to watch Hello Good Game. Today is the start of a very special series, Magic the Gathering Arena Beginner Guides. This is part 1. What style or what type of deck should I use or should you be using as a free-to-play or beginner individual? We're going to talk about all of the different deck archetypes, and then you'll be able to make an informed decision of what style you want to play as a beginner. As a beginner, you lack wildcards, you lack a collection. So to make this informed decision right out of the gates is one of the most advantageous moves you can make within Magic the Gathering Arena, and just building yourself a good base or a good platform to progress from. So without further ado, if you find any value within this video, it'd be great if you gave me a thumbs up and shared it out to a friend. Welcome to part 1. What style or what type of deck should I use? There are 4 main deck archetypes within Magic the Gathering Arena. We have Aggro, Midrange, Control, and Combo. Each of these decks stands for different things. We're going to break down them each individually, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the hybrid strategies afterwards, which include multiple angles to form one deck, which is really, really cool and quite powerful. So let's get right into it. Aggro is short for aggressive. These decks attempt to reduce their opponent's life from 20 to 0 as quickly as possible, rather than emphasizing on a long-term game plan. Aggro decks focus on converting their cards into damage, and they prefer to engage in a race for tempo rather than card advantage. Generally, they rely on creatures as its cumulative source of damage. However, they can also quickly overwhelm unprepared opponents and proceed to take out the last bit of their health with reach spells such as direct damage spells. Aggro decks generally have access to disruptive elements, which can inhibit the opponent's ability to respond to their moves. We have a couple example cards for you guys that I want to talk about, and a quick reminder that as we continue through this process, we're going to be diving into each of these archetypes a little bit further. In mono red, we see Robber of the Rich. This is a 2/2 with haste and reach. Whenever it attacks and the opponent has more cards in their hand than we do, we get to exile the top card of their library, and we can play it any turn that we attack with a rogue. So this is a 2/2 for 2. That's base vanilla value. That's bad. It's got reach. Okay. It has haste. Very good. However, it also has that ability that I just mentioned, where if our opponent has more cards in their hand than we do, we get to exile off the top and play that whenever we attack with a rogue. This gives us card advantage because now we can play our opponent's cards rather than just our own. It also will help us disrupt their draw. Maybe they don't have all the lands that they need in their hand, and we're taking them off the top, and then they're just drawing those high-cost spells that they can't play anyways, right? So Robber of the Rich is a very cool mono-red aggro creature. It's got a low converted mana cost of 2, reach, haste, plus it's a 2/2, so very good base value there, and this bomb ability attached to it, which can really help sway some of those matches. There's nothing better than taking a Shatter of the Sky off the top from your opponent's library, and then he can't wipe the field. So Robber of the Rich is a really cool example of a mono-red aggro creature. In white, we have Venerated Loxodon for 5. And now I know what you're saying. 5 converted mana, that's too expensive for an aggro deck. We just talked about how low converted mana cost creatures are advantageous because we can play multiples per turn. So Venerated Loxodon is expensive. However, when we take a closer look, we see that it has Convoke. Your creatures can help cast this spell. Each creature you tap while casting the spell pays for 1 of the mana within that creature's color. Venerated Loxodon enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that convoked it. So this fits into the mono white or white weenies archetype rather than mono red. It is more expensive. However, with its convoke cost, we're able to cast this sometimes on turn 3 or turn 4. Because within mono white, we want to play 1-drop mono white weenies, right? So we'll be flooding the field with creatures, and then we can use all of those creatures as mana. On turn 3, we'll have 3 mana and at least 3 creatures on the battlefield. We could have as many as 4. So we should easily be able to throw this Venerated Loxodon out much earlier than turn 5, which is the 5 converted mana cost. So this is a great aggro card for white weenies, and I wanted to showcase the different effects. This doesn't have reach, this doesn't have haste, no abilities like Death Touch or Trample there. However, it puts an Anthem effect basically, or +1/+1 counters on all of your creatures which you are flooding the field with. So you're going to have a lot of them. So that's very good value. Say you get like maybe 5 to 6 +1/+1 counters spread along all of your creatures. So that is a very cool effect. Not only does it make them stronger to hit your opponent, but it's also going to make them a little bit tougher as well, so they can survive some of those damage effects potentially. Goblin Chain Whirler comes to mind within Historic that can deal 1 damage to every creature when it enters the battlefield. Not after Venerated Loxodon turns all of your 1/1s into 2/2s. So that's why Venerated Loxodon gets my pick to showcase within Mono White aggro. We also have Gruul Spellbreaker. Now, Gruul is one of the staple mark aggro deck archetypes, consisting of red and green. We have green creatures and red removal. Gruul Spellbreaker costs 3, so that's pretty low to the ground, right? That's a middle ground between the Loxodon and the Robber of the Rich. It's a 3/3, so the value's there. It's pretty vanilla, right? We see that it has Riot, and this creature enters the battlefield with your choice of a +1/+1 counter or haste. So if we see a Shatter to the Sky, we get wiped, we can play him with haste, and we're immediately dealing damage again. If we need to be bigger and badder, we can use the +1/+1 ability from the Riot to have a 4/4. He organically has Trample, which is incredible for an aggro deck. This means that when he's blocked, if he does more damage than that creature's toughness, that excess damage goes into our opponent's health points, which is really, really cool. And then as long as it's your turn, you and Gruul Spellbreaker have Hexproof, which is really great against maybe some of those decks that are trying to target you or your creatures with spells. So Gruul Spellbreaker is an absolute staple mark of Gruul aggro, and just a great example of aggro creatures in general. The ability to have haste. It's relatively cheap for its strength and toughness. It has secondary effects like Reach or Trample or Haste. And then as long as it's our turn, we've got Hexproof. And that's really cool as well. So cards that encapsulate a lot of value for what you get. This game does come down to getting more value out of your cards and out of your plays than your opponent can. So Gruul Spellbreaker is a great creature within the aggro archetype. That's it for aggro, you guys. We talked about it. We have fast matches. We have a high win rate. It's very beginner friendly, and it deals direct damage to your opponent. If you are a beginner, I really recommend aggro decks because of the fact that they are fast matches and beginner friendly. A lot of the aggro decks don't require a lot of mythics or rares to get going. So as a free-to-play beginner, it's great, especially when you start looking at trying to farm some of the constructed events. The mono red aggro specifically is going to get you there. We're moving on to mid-range now. Mid-range focuses on outpacing / outvaluing your opponents. We get to go bigger than aggro, right? Because they've got those creatures that maybe top out at 4/4. Mid-range, we're going to be playing much bigger and much badder creatures that can totally just stop our aggro opponents. We also have the ability to get underneath of control, because control is such a long game and a slow ramp without any ramp spells. We can use our own ramp spells to get up to that 6 or 7 mana availability on the board and start casting some of those big spells that our opponent doesn't yet have access to. We get to ramp in the early game, and then later on in the game, we get to cast really expensive spells, which is quite nice. A typical mid-range deck has an early game plan of mana ramp and control, but begins to play threats once it reaches 4 to 6 mana. A mid-range deck will often seek to play a reactive, non-attrition-based game against aggro decks, and a more proactive, tempo-based game against control decks. This is referred to as going bigger and getting under. We have some really cool example cards within mid-range. I've included Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. This is an absolute beast. For 3 mana, it's a 6/6. It does sacrifice itself unless it's escaped. The escape cost is 4, plus exiling 5 cards from your graveyard. So it's a little bit weird to get the actual body on the field, but look at the value that this card gives you. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you gain 3 life, draw a card, and may play an additional land from your hand to the battlefield. That's incredible. So mid-range needs to become stronger than aggro decks. This is done through survivability, which is life gain, which is creating those big blockers, right? So Uro is a 6/6 once you can get him on the field. That's going to stop out any aggro attacks, absolutely at 100%. And then whenever he attacks, you're gaining 3 life and drawing a card. So that's really going to outvalue your opponent unless they have a really good draw engine behind them as well. Next up, we have Nissa, who shakes the world. This is a legendary planeswalker coming into the field with 5 loyalty, a static ability of whenever you tap a forest for mana, add an additional green mana source, +1, put 3 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 target non-creature land you control. Untap it, it becomes a elemental creature with vigilance and haste that's still a land. It is a 0/0, however, because of the +3 counters, it will be a 3/3. -8, you get an emblem with lands you control have indestructible, and you get to search your library for any amount of forest cards, put them into the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. This is not only an amazing ramp card, it's a little expensive, but we're going to be ramping with things like Boreal Grazer, Growth Spiral, Uro, like we just seen, into Nissa. We're not going to be playing Nissa on turn 5. We're going to be playing her on turn 4, ideally on turn 3. Not only do we ramp into her, which creates the 3/3s, which have vigilance, absolutely incredible. They can become indestructible, but the land value that we have has now doubled, so we can ramp even further, right? We just went from having 5 available mana probably to having close to 10 available mana with Nissa, who shakes the world. So it's a great way to just get so much more available resources than your opponent. Not only do you get the available mana, but you get the field presence with the 3/3s as well. So Nissa, who shakes the world, is an amazing mid-range card. Next up, we have Casualties of War. Now, this is actually one of my favorite cards. It's a little expensive. Casualties of War is a sorcery card for 6, 2 green, 2 black sources, 2 colorless. We get to choose 1 or more. Destroy target artifact, creature, enchantment, land, and or planeswalker. That is a huge amount of value, you guys. That is, ooh. So within the ramp decks, we're getting more available resources than our opponent. This can flood us into some of these huge value spells like Casualties of War, like Mass Manipulation if you're interested in other cards, that can really shut down our opponent. In this case, Casualties of Wars can destroy a land 100% for sure, and it can most likely always destroy a creature. When you are ramping and you start destroying your opponent's lands, you're really spreading the gap between you guys, which is incredible. And if you can play this even maybe a little later game, you can get an artifact, an enchantment, and a planeswalker with it potentially, while still holding all of your value. So Casualties of War is just incredibly oppressive within the mid-range removal category. It is expensive. It costs 6. This is not something you're going to be playing early. However, you can ramp into it and potentially lay out a couple of these, and your opponent will not be able to fight back, especially if they themselves are not playing a ramp deck, right? Or a mid-range deck. I always refer to mid-range strictly as ramp, but ramp is just one of the archetypes within mid-range. If you're interested in seeing all of these decks broken down more in depth to their sub-archetypes, we will be doing that in the future as well. So we're moving on to Control now. Control devalues your opponent's cards. It's the slowest deck style of the 4. It has a lot of removal and counter magic. It needs to survive early game. That's its weakness. And it dominates the late game, which is its strength. Control decks avoid racing to attempt to slow the game down by executing an attrition plan. As the game progresses, control decks are able to take advantage of their slower, more powerful cards. Primary strength of control decks is their ability to devalue their opponent's cards. We can do this in a few different ways. Answering threats at a reduced cost. So if your opponent plays a creature worth 6 and you can remove it with a spell worth 3, now you can see how similar to the ramp deck, we are making our value worth more than our opponent's. He's using more resources, we're using less, and we're keeping the value the same. We can not play threats to be answered. That means basically having an empty field potentially, and we're just holding up counter spells. That means that if they have removal, it's not going to work. It's doing nothing. It's a dead card in their hand. They play their creatures. We destroy their creatures. They can't destroy anything of ours. We can disrupt synergies. So this comes into play with cards maybe like Narset and Teferi, which we're actually going to touch on in a second, to shut down their draw, to shut down them playing instant speed spells. So just really kind of trying to lock them in. We also can drag out the game, which is really fun. So for example, aggro decks, they're going to top out at 3 mana. They're not going to be doing much after that. There's not always a ton of draw engines within them. So I like to wait for them to play out their whole hand. They don't have any more cards in their hand. Boom, you clean up the field. And now the game is absolutely done for your opponent. They're drawing 1 card a turn. You probably have draw engines within your control deck, right? Because you're getting a lot more value. Instant speed as well. So that's one of the great benefits of control, is being able to play on your opponent's turn at instant speed, right? If he doesn't play a threat for you to remove, then you can use a draw spell to draw more cards before your turn starts. So control decks are very, very powerful. Speaking of very powerful cards, we're talking about Teferi the Time Raveler. This is a 3-drop 4 loyalty planeswalker with a massive static ability. Each opponent can cast spells only anytime they can cast a sorcery. So this absolutely locks them down. They're not playing instant speed on your turn ever, and they can't play instant speed on their turn if it's on the stack, right? So they could play the sorcery, or they could play the instant as if it were sorcery. If we counter it and they have an instant speed spell, they can't play that instant speed spell on top of the stack, which is just so oppressive. And it just shuts down a large variety of decks with Teferi. Not only that, +1, until your next turn, you may cast sorcery spells as though they had flash. This increases your value. This makes all of your sorcery spells instant speed. That's absolutely incredible. -3, return up to 1 target artifact, creature, or enchantment to its owner's hand. Draw a card. Woof. This is a very nice tempo play, bouncing something of theirs, where now they have to replay or repay that mana or card, and then you get a draw off of that as well. So you can see very easily just how Teferi is able to oppress your opponent while increasing your own value. We have more creatures, or planeswalkers I should say, like that. Narset Parter of Veils coming in with 5 loyalty. She's also a 3-drop. Each opponent can't draw more than 1 card each turn. We talked about locking your opponent out and disrupting their forms or styles of play. They can't cast sorceries with Teferi. They can't draw more than 1 card each turn with Narset. If you can combine these 2 cards, now we are cooking with fire, right? And we can just keep adding these oppressive features or effects onto our opponent until eventually they just can't do anything and we're able to still play freely. She also has a -2 ability. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So in a control deck, we don't have a lot of creatures. We have primarily non-creature spells. So Narset allows us to find the specific card we need for that situation. Potentially our opponent has an aggro deck and we need to find our removal. We play Narset, do the ability. Not only do we find the removal for next turn, but now our opponent is forced to take priority off of our health points onto Narset to deal with her threat, right? Because having 1 draw is bad. Giving your opponent 2 draws with a Narset on the field is absolutely terrifying. Looking 8 cards deep in their library, you know they're going to find an answer for you. So Narset Parter of Veils is another incredible planeswalker in control decks to really devalue your opponent, making them not be able to draw a card and making sure that you still are able to do everything that you could ever want to do. Moving on, we talked about field wipes. Shatter the Sky is a prime example here. It costs 4. Each player who controls a creature with power 4 or greater draws a card, then destroy all creatures. So it's got a little bit of a downside to the fact that if they are running maybe a little bit heavier deck, a Gruul aggro or something, or even just like a mid-range, right, that they're going to get to draw the card because they have a creature with power 4 or greater. You never really want to let your opponent draw cards. However, as a control deck, having them draw cards is no problem. Maybe you have a Narset on the field and they can't draw cards, right? So each player who controls a creature with power 4 or greater draws a card, then destroy all creatures. The destroying all creatures is really important here because as a control deck, like previously stated, we don't have any creatures. So that's no harm, no foul towards us. We're just getting 2-for-1s, 3-for-1s, hopefully 4-for-1s, right? Using Shatter the Sky to eat multiple creatures off of our opponent's board states, now allowing us to survive that early game into the mid game and late game, at which case we can begin to dominate. So control is one of the more advanced archetypes. We talked about devaluing our opponent's cards, it being one of the slower deck styles, it having a ton of answers through removal and counter magic, needing those answers to survive the early game so it can start to flex out and dominate in the late game. Moving on, we have combo decks. Now these are a lot of fun. We're going to be using 2 or more cards together to instantly win or really oppress our opponent to the point where he concedes, right? This includes protection from disruption and intends to be fast, consistent, and resilient, combining powerful synergies to increase the reliability of these combo decks. Combo decks use the interaction of 2 or more cards, a combination, to create a powerful effect that either wins the game immediately or creates a situation that subsequently leads to a win. Combo decks value consistency, speed, and resilience. The deck should be reliable enough to produce the combo on a regular basis. The deck should be able to use the combo fast enough to win before the opponent, obviously, and the deck should be able to withstand disruption and still win. Many decks have a similar feel where they're combo-like interactions that aren't quite combo, and we just want to refer to these interactions as high-valued synergies. Not all decks with synergies are combos. Only decks that can use a combination of 2 or more cards to instantly win or win in the following turns. So there is a little bit of leeway there, and a lot of people will refer to jank decks as combo, which they generally are, but make sure that we're really relying on a few cards, obviously no more than 6 cards to complete our combo. But combo decks can be a lot of fun, and they're really at the heart of Magic for a lot of the content creators. Let's begin to talk about some of the combos that we see. Recently, we've seen the release of Vito Thorn of the Dusk Rose. This is a 3-drop 1/3. Whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. We can also pay 5. Creatures you control gain lifelink until end of turn. So this by itself isn't really anything to brag about, right? It's pretty cool. It's a 1/3 for 3. Obviously, that's like super vanilla and actually kind of bad. But whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. Okay, so we could kind of work around that. We could add some synergies to that deck, right? We could make a very high synergy deck and potentially an aggro style deck. The ability to pay 5 is more mid-range. I don't know how easy it's going to be to get to 5 mana just to give our 1 creature, which is a 1/3 lifelink. So that could be kind of weird. However, maybe there's big baddies we can give lifelink to. So that's itself. Revenge. Sorcery speed for 6. Double your life total. Target opponent loses half their life, rounded up. Okay, that's a pretty powerful card, but it costs 6, so it doesn't win us the game. It could easily be countered. Why would I run this? Well, normally you wouldn't, but when we can combine these 2 cards together, this is a 1-hit kill. Whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. Double your life total. You start with 20 life. If you double 20, it goes to 40, and whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. So you've just done 20 damage to your opponent, and your opponent loses half their life rounded down. With these 2 cards, if you have 20 life, you've just done 30 damage to your opponent. That is a 1-hit total knockout, TKO, right? So that's an incredibly powerful combo. Combining 2 cards that normally are so-so, put them together, boom, we win the game, right? We also have another one that's really prevalent in the current meta. It will be shifting to Historic soon. It's Wilderness Reclamation and Explosion. Wilderness Rec is a 4-drop enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, untap all lands you control. Explosion is an instant speed spell, costing 4 plus X. Explosion deals X damage to any target, and target player draws X cards. So, Wilderness Rec aims to obviously get more than 4 lands on the field to play Wilderness Reclamation, and then Explosion costs 4 as well. A couple turns go by, we've got more lands. Wilderness Reclamation also stacks if you have multiple copies of it. This allows us to, on our end step, tap all of our lands for mana, untap them with Wilderness Rec, re-tap them, untap them with a second Wilderness Rec if we have it, and then cast our Explosion, dealing incredible amounts of damage to your opponent. With Wilderness Reclamation on the field, we need 12 mana to 1-hit our opponent if we have a single copy of Wilderness Rec. If we have 2 copies of Wilderness Reclamation on the field, we only need 6 mana to 1-hit our opponent, which is actually pretty incredible, right? So the fact that you can finish your opponent with each of these combos with only 6 mana is insane. Wilderness Rec does require an extra card, which is the second copy of Wilderness Rec, if you want to get it off at 6. However, being able to win a game on turn 6 is incredible. And it's extremely consistent and reliable as well, because not only can you deal direct damage to your opponent, but you could kill their creatures and survive and do all that as well. So Veto, Revenge, Wilderness Reclamation, Explosion, some of the coolest and most powerful combos within the Magic the Gathering Arena overall game, right? So combos are using 2 or more cards to instantly win. Includes protection from disruption, intensity fast, consistent, and resilient. Combines powerful synergies. I also want to talk about the power level of these decks. They're not all the same. As we progress through the game, the power level changes. So I've got a couple nice graphs to show you guys here. The first one is showcasing control, aggro, and combo. We've left mid-range out just so you can see the layers of the graph. And now you'll see on, I believe, the x-axis, turn 1 to turn 10, and then on the y-axis, 0% to 100%. So you'll have your turn versus your power level, right? Let's look at a control deck. We can see in the background that it is a linear line going from 0 to 100 as the game progresses. Control decks are very weak early game, and as the game goes on, they get stronger and stronger and stronger until you can absolutely do nothing against them. Next up, we have aggro decks. Now, aggro decks are very strong out of the gate. Turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, they're looking to kill you. Turn 4, they probably did it. If you can survive past turn 5, now you're really looking at increasing your chances of winning. So you can see how the aggro deck is a slow decline and then tapers out as it gets near to the end. We also have combo decks. Now, these are really crazy. Combo decks obviously don't really fire off until like turn 5, normally at the earliest, turn 6 probably, unless we're ramping. So it's very slow, very weak. And then when you do get to that pinnacle of your turn, it's very strong. However, if you don't get the combo off, it becomes very weak. Potentially, maybe you're not drawing the combo in your hand from your deck. Maybe your opponent has countered it, has taken your combo out of your deck. So they can become incredibly weak as the game goes on. Next up, we are looking at aggro control, which is an archetype we've not yet looked at, but I did want to include it here. It's known as tempo. So it's a little bit slower, but it has a huge mid-game advantage. Turn 2 really till about turn 6 or turn 7, this deck dominates in the fact that it can have the attacks out, much like an aggro deck. It's doing the chip damage, and it can counter your spells or disrupt your plays as well quite consistently. So we are going to take a look at the deck hybrid types here in a second, and then we're looking at mid-range here. So mid-range is what we talked about, ramping early on and then playing those huge spells late game. So mid-range is exactly what it sounds like, a mid-range deck. So turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, maybe even turn 4, not very strong unless we've ramped into something incredible. However, turn 5, turn 6, turn 7, turn 8, we are probably the strongest consistent deck within the different archetypes. We've got a lot of 5 and 6 drops to play consistently that have high value over our opponent. As the game goes on, we do taper off a little bit, only due to the fact that control is so powerful and that we won't really be able to compete with the bulk amount of removal that they have. So this, I think, is a really cool graph just to demonstrate how the different decks will operate within the meta against each other. So we see that aggro decks are very strong off the start, and then the aggro control decks also do a fairly good job off the start. Next up, mid-range probably gets the slight nod because it can fire off around turn 5, where where combo decks don't really get there until around turn 6 potentially. And then they have a huge decline. And then of course we have control, the powerhouse, that's just the engine that could, going right up to 100% eventually. So before we wrap up today's video, I want to talk about the hybrid strategies. We mentioned control aggro. We also have control combo, aggro combo, mid-range control, and aggro control combo. So we're going to break down these a little bit more extensively in another video because they are more advanced strategies, and I wanted to keep this to only encapsulate some of the beginner information. Obviously, we could go in depth and rabbit hole on these subjects forever. Hopefully, with this overview, you can see how the different deck archetypes will engage with each other at different times throughout your games. Aggro decks are strong really early. Mid-range and tempo decks are great in the mid-game. Control decks absolutely dominate the late game. So this was aggro, control, mid-range, combo. We kind of discussed a little bit about each of them, how they operate, what they're good for, what they're bad against. So you should be able to make a pretty informed decision about what deck archetype you want to begin playing in Magic the Gathering Arena as a beginner. I did mention hybrid strategies to begin this video, and I'm going to recap them, but we will be taking a look at them in the future. We have aggro control. We've seen this in our graph. This is a aggro deck with early game interactions through creatures, lots of the time having flash. And then we have a tempo style play where we are continually countering their creatures and drawing cards. We have control combo, also known as prison. So this is very similar to a control deck that has worked in a combo style wind condition. Aggro combo, this is an aggro deck that, by the lords that be, have a combo tuned into them as well. You can call maybe potentially Annex Embercleave a combo, right? So maybe that one mono red deck could fit in with an aggro combo because that definitely does finish games. We have midrange control. A great example of this is the new Bant ramp deck that just has a ton of ramp, a ton of like Elspeth Conquers Death, Shatter Skies, so a lot of field control to protect against those aggro decks and midrange decks. And then they just have the absolute control finish where they lock you down. We also have aggro control combo. Now these are very weird, but they do exist. I'm not sure if we have any of them within the Magic the Gathering Arena format yet. That's probably something that's going to come into play as we progress and keep adding cards into the historic pool. I know that Jumpstart just came out. We have Amocat Remastered to come out, and then Zendikar Rising comes out as well in September with renewal season. So there's big things happening in historic. If you're new to the channel, I focus on free-to-play and beginner content. So don't be scared. It's my journey or my goal to bridge the gap for the audience between standard into the more friendly historic format. So thanks for watching, you guys. I really appreciate your continued time and attention. I want to remind you, if you found any value within this video, to like, comment, subscribe, share it to a friend, and go ahead and hit that bell icon so you're notified of all of my future uploads. I'm live on YouTube every single day at 6 a.m. Mountain Standard. At 7 a.m. Mountain Standard, I go live on Twitch for 3 to 4 hours, and then we're in the Discord for the remainder of the day. Links for everything is in the description below. Thank you so much for your continued time and attention. It really helps in supporting the channel. Everyone going above and beyond, answering the war cry, helping me financially, not only myself, but the community as a whole, we all thank you so much. You're making content like this possible and having it come to fruition into reality. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure to follow along for the future parts of the series. Take care, have a great day, and good luck in your matches.